Hey, everybody. Welcome to the January 2024 SJAA imaging meeting. And tonight we have Andy Campbell to tell us all about award-winning astrophotography. So Andy, please take it away.
Thanks so much. Hi, and thanks everybody for inviting me to have a chat with you from all the way over here in Melbourne, Australia. It's currently a 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's a miserable, wet, miserable, typical Melbourne day here. Good opportunity for me to spend some lovely time with you, lovely people. So I've got a little presentation for you on award-winning images and some of the secrets behind it. And hopefully we can share some knowledge and gain something from that. Got a special guest appearance here from Steve Boddy, who's one of our compatriots here in Australia who's done particularly well recently with awards. So no doubt Steve will take the opportunity to jump in and share some of his wisdom as well. And hopefully we can all pick up a tip or two and learn a few things from each other today. So if it's all right with you guys, I'll share my screen and we'll crack on with a presentation. So just let me know if you can see that all right, and if you can hear me okay, and if you can understand my accent.
All looks good.
Excellent. All righty, so we're here to understand a little bit about the mechanics and idiosyncrasies and secrets behind astrophotography competitions, and let's talk about that now. So, who is Andy Campbell? Well, I'm a resident of a place called Melbourne, Australia, not Melbourne in Florida, Melbourne, Australia. We have a fairly large population here. It's arguably the second largest city in Australia and soon to overtake Sydney in population. We're well down south, so we get to see a lot of stuff in our skies that you people unfortunately don't see. We have probably some of the most interesting objects in the Southern Hemisphere. And Orion, of course, is the right way up for us. If you ever come to Australia, you'll find it's upside down for you guys. Melbourne is famous for several things, but it's known as the sporting capital of Australia. We have a thing called AFL, which rules over here. It's our version of football. We're well known for a horse race that stops the nation, the Melbourne Cup. We also have the Grand Prix, the Australian Open, and lots of other things that our politicians like to bring us. And we're also famous for our food. Very cosmopolitan city. And I've been living here for 25 years now and absolutely love it. That said, about me personally, I'm a family man. I've got a married and I have 3 amazing teenage sons. Now that they're teenagers, of course, we only see them when they're hungry, but they're a good bunch. I'm a professional photographer by trade. I shoot headshots for CEOs, execs, politicians, lawyers, basically people in suits, and that's a photograph of my studio. Been running that business for 23 years. And somewhere along the line, perhaps 10 or 12 years ago, I picked up this astrophotography hobby. And along the journey, I became a contributor to and then a staff member of Astro, which is all volunteers, of course. And I've been a judge there for, I think, 5 years now. All righty. With regard to my own astro images, you can find them on my website, which is, the URL is there, andysastro.com. I'm also on all the other usual places. Obviously, I've got a presence on AstroBin and Facebook and Instagram. So you can find my stuff there. And of course, wouldn't be an astrophotographer without a telescope. So this is my current weapon of choice. And it's living semi-permanently on a rural property with a mate of mine on his dark site, because the Bortle scale here in Melbourne is probably closer to 7, maybe even 8, whereas on his property it's sort of a nice 3 or possibly even 2 on a good night. So the unit gets to get a bit more proper use out there. And it's all his fault, because 10 years ago he rocked up at my door and he gave me an old telescope, and I thought, why are you giving me an old telescope? He says, so, show your kids the moon. So I showed the kids the moon, and they got excited about that for 20 minutes. And then, of course, I started thinking, I wonder if it's possible to, take photos with this thing. And of course, it wasn't. But eventually I went down the slippery slope, as we all go down. And here we are with some nice equipment. And that's a close-up. The camera is very new. I've only had that for a couple of months now, and it's still basically been installed, but the last components of that have just arrived, and hopefully this weekend it'll be fully operational. Alrighty, let's get on to the subject at hand. So why would you want to enter an astrophotography competition? And I guess these are some of the core reasons why you'd consider doing that. Essentially, it's a chance to learn and improve, because astrophotography is something a lot of us do as a solitary profession in the dark by ourselves. We have a lot of technical and issues that we need to work through and resolve. But sometimes, on that magic night when everything's working and the skies are clear and everything's going well, we can turn out an image that we're pleased with. And then I guess, of course, you sort of start asking yourself, well, how good is it really? So a competition is a chance where you can measure yourself against your peers and indeed perhaps challenge yourself to take that image or your imagery generally to the next level. But most important of all, it's the chance to get feedback. And some astrophotography competitions, and we'll go into that in more detail later, do give you the opportunity for written feedback. A lot don't, and that can be frustrating. Literally, you pay your money, you put your images in, the announcement comes up, and you're all full of expectation, and well, you dipped out, you've got nothing, and you got no feedback to explain what happened. And that can be disappointing. So it's nice when you do enter a competition where there is some feedback, because then you got an idea of, oh, okay, that's what the judge was looking for, that's what they saw, and this is where I need to improve. So having that opportunity for feedback is probably the most valuable reason to enter a competition, in my opinion. So that said, let's consider some of the options and some of the considerations behind any form of competition judging, and what is it that these judges are looking for? What makes an image so special? And I've broken it up in this case into three main categories. So you've got your technical criteria, and we all know what they are. You've got your processing, which is equally important, if not more so. And then you've got the X factor, what we call the creative and subjective criteria behind what makes your image special. So what we're going to do now is we're going to break this down a little bit, go through some of these, give you some examples, show you a little bit about what the judges like, what they don't like, what works, what doesn't. And hopefully by the end of all of this, you'll have a little bit of an idea of what the magic formula is when you next go out and fire up that telescope. So let's look first of all at the technical criteria. And these are some of the issues that we've all dealt with, that we've all had to overcome, and that perhaps we still deal with and still overcome. But all of these things are really important, and the judges don't miss a trick. So all of these have to be up to speed, and they have to be right. And if you've got an issue with internal reflections, or if you've got some problems with tilt in your OTA, it's going to show up like, I'll use an Australian vernacular there, but I'll save you that one. It'll show up very obviously, and you don't want it to detract from the assessment of your image. Equally, there's some environmental factors that may be out of your control, and you'll see a lot of them here. And ultimately, we want to be recording the best possible technical result under the ideal conditions to create the best quality data. And if any of these factors haven't been checked off as being, that's perfect, that's right, that's good, I've got this, then your image is going to suffer a little bit at the scoring range. So let's just take a couple of these now and talk a little bit more in detail and give some examples. So you'll hear me talk a little bit about guiding. So what's going on with guiding? Well, if you've got any issues with tracking or elongated stars, then maybe it's just down to your guiding. Maybe your guiding's not working. Now, this is a reasonable guiding graph coming out of PhD, and it's what I would call certainly good enough. You know, it's well within a half an arc second in this case. And you can chase your tail on this. You can work until you get that ultimate perfect flat line. But at this particular example, this is going to give you round stars. And round stars is what you want. And I'm not saying for a moment that you shouldn't go out and try and get the most amazing, perfect guiding that you can. And if you have a off-site, dark site, permanent observatory, then obviously you'll spend the time to make this absolutely perfect. But if you're, I guess, a traveler, if you go to a dark site because your skies are Bortle 8 and you want to go out to a Bortle 2 dark site, you probably don't want to spend half your night just getting polar aligned, but you do want to spend enough time to get it at least this close. And using some of the more contemporary methods, such as in my case, I use an iPolar, which plate solves, and I can get to this sort of level within about 10 minutes. There's some other versions of this on the market that are really, really good, and some software that you can use. But you don't want to spend, half your night drift aligning just to get to the point where, you can start imaging. And the bane of my life is and has been tilt. Up until recently, my previous camera was supplied from the factory with a tilted sensor. And oh my gosh, I think I spent 2 years chasing the tilt out of the thing. And this is a program called ASTAP. ASTAP is free, and it has this CCD-like inspector opportunity within it, and it works brilliantly. Now, you can get something called CCD Inspector, which is a terrific program. It's not cheap. You do have to pay for it. Or you can use ASTAP, which is free and does this job very well. And as you can see with this example up on your top left, there's a discrepancy there between the other 3 corners. And what that basically shows up is that you've got a warp speed star on the top left there, and that's heading out at an angle. And that's simply showing me that the tilt on the camera is not sorted, it's not correct. And so if you've got tilt or coma, which is where spacing issues come in, and you've either got warp speed because it's too close or fishbowl effect because it's too far away, or whichever way around that is, you're going to have stars that aren't round. And judges hate stars that aren't round. They just, doesn't matter how perfect your image is, if the stars aren't round, they're just not going to work. So you want something that looks as close to or as possible as this. And this is with the new camera, I think straight out of the box. It was pretty good. I think we've actually gone out and leveled it up a little bit more since then, but this will certainly give you round stars in all the corners. Has anyone else had issues with tilt? Because I'm sure you have.
Tilted sensor as well.
Tilted sensor, yeah.
Well,
So
yeah,
hard.
I'm having nightmares.
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm
So
having
hard.
nightmares with tilt.
Yep. Yeah,
Well, I wanted to
tilt's a
ask,
killer.
so the so-called modern approach to this is blur exterminator. What's your reaction to that?
Well, Blur Exterminator is a fantastic program. I've seen some amazing results from it, but at the end of the day, it's no substitute for getting it right in the first place. And what's that? Lipstick on a pig, I think is an expression. You can correct stars to a degree, but if you're way out, nothing's going to fix it. And I think that's the issue there. You want to make sure that it's basically right as best you can.
Thanks.
So let's move on and talk about processing. And here's a whole bunch of factors that need to be considered if you're going to, start processing your images. So you want to make sure that, you've got good flats. Are you taking flats the right way? Are you shooting sky flats automated, as I do, with a program called Voyager, or are you using a flat box or a flat panel? Because whichever way you do it, you want to have consistency behind it, and they need to be right. If you're shooting your bias, they're pretty straightforward. If you're shooting dark flats or darks, then they need to be up to date and obviously consistent and shot at the correct temperatures to take out the noise. If you're stretching an image and if you overstretch it, you're going to blow your highlights, you're going to make your stars bigger. If you understretch it, maybe you're missing out on some of the detail that's lurking there in the shadows. Noise is a killer. We've seen some fantastic images in Astrobin that have come through as far as to the judging queue. And then with Astrobin, we can, of course, press the button that shows us the image at full resolution. And you get this nice image that looks fabulous on the screen, and then you blow it up to 100%, and it's like, oh, there's a whole bunch of noise in there. That's a real shame, because if we'd used, for example, Blur Exterminator, we could have got rid of that noise in milliseconds. And it kind of let the image down, and maybe it almost got there, but didn't get promoted for that reason. Clarity and fine details. Don't want to open the can of worms here, but we get a sense of what amount of detail is available and should be seen and can be seen, because we can refer on a known object to Hubble or indeed James Webb Telescope to get a sense of what sort of detail is there. If there's more detail in your image from your 8-inch reflector taken under your Bortle 8 sky than can be seen in the Hubble, and you've used Topaz or something like that, and you've pushed that button that hits the noise and reduces it and puts all this wonderful detail in there that actually doesn't exist, you might find yourself in a bit of trouble with that image getting assessed, because, of course, things like Topaz are trained on terrestrial objects. They're trained on trees and skies and landscapes and fences. And when it comes to try and assess an astronomical image, and it sees dust cloud and tendrils, and it thinks, oh, I'll make that sharper and clearer, and it over-exaggerates that detail to the point where it's creating detail that wasn't there, then your image is going to suffer at the assessment level, because judges will be comparing it with known images to know, well, okay, that's too much detail in this case. Equally, sometimes details are lost in processing. Maybe we've pushed the color saturation too hard, or we've overlaid just one too many layers of something there. And sometimes it's good to just go back to your luminosity and just compare, well, okay, that's the detail I should be seeing, and in my final result, I'm losing it. So hopefully that makes some sort of sense. With the dynamic range, this is a really important one. We want to see detail in the highlights, and we want to see detail in the shadows. So if you've got M42, which is, of course, one of the most extraordinary targets out there with a wide dynamic range, we want to know that when you zoom into the trapezium, that we can see detail there. But we don't want to see the dynamic range compressed. So the core of M42 should be bright, because those 6 stars are lighting up that entire nebula. If it's flat, if those details at that core are so flattened out that the whole image is now kind of monochromatic, if you like, it's going to lose impact, it's going to lose punch. And in the same way, if you've opened up those shadows to the nth degree, where you've got absolutely every bit of detail showing, but we're not actually seeing what should be a shadow, then that's going to create a problem, because the dynamic range has been compressed too far. So essentially, the dark bit should look dark and the bright bit should look bright, but there should be detail in both. Hope that makes sense. And of course, the sky needs to look like sky. It shouldn't have gradients in it. It shouldn't have funny colors in it. And it should be uniform. There shouldn't be, I guess, colors transgressing into that wouldn't exist in nature, as best we can see. We touched a little bit on this earlier, but the clarity at native and higher resolutions is really important, particularly if you're in a competition environment, because the judges will pixel pick. They'll go through your image at the highest possible level because they can, and because some of them are more technically orientated, and they'll just kind of hammer on that and they'll go, you know what? That would have been a great image if the photographer had taken a little bit more care to view it at the highest possible resolution on a calibrated monitor. Now, we are all using calibrated monitors, aren't we, folks? Hands up if you are. Okay. Hands up if you're not. Okay, don't embarrass yourselves, but seriously, if you're not calibrating your monitor, you're in no man's land, because what looks good to you is going to look probably completely different and maybe not nearly as good to the world at large, and particularly that judge or judging panel who's looking at your image. Very important you calibrate your monitors. Star quality. Gosh, it's probably the single one thing that judges look for first, foremost, and last in an image. And stars need to be round, airy discs. They need to have soft edges and they need natural colors. So if the stars aren't round, your image will go. If your stars are hard edge, crispy things, they're just not going to look natural. And with regard to colors, well, they need to look natural. It's not hard to look up what good star colors look like. And if you're doing narrowband, and if you like that blend of Hubble palette where you get those purple stars, well, that's great if you like discos. And if you're, if you're a child of the 70s, but it's so easy nowadays to use a couple of tricks in Photoshop to desaturate those stars, get that purple out, change them even for RGB stars. Purple stars are a bit of a no-no nowadays. Is your color palette? Have you pushed the sliders that far that it's like, wow, that looks fantastic? Or have you just gone too far? Is it overpowering? We've already touched a little bit on depth and contrast with regard to our dynamic range. But if you've got a bit of a 3D effect with your image, if you've got that sense of wonder, of depth, then it's going to really make a difference to how that image is perceived. And it needs to be natural. And then, of course, you've got the ultimate debate of stars or starless. So let's look at a couple of examples here, folks. Okay, so here's an image that I've shot, and we've got some RGB stars. Nothing tricky going on here. This is straight LRGB. The stars themselves look okay. There's a lot of noise in this image, though. In fact, it's noisier than the MCG on Grand Final Day, or maybe to put it in American terms, noisy as your NBA basketball game at finals. It's not that difficult to process that out and to come up with something that looks a whole lot cleaner and a whole lot nicer. So that's the same image after some processing. So we've got nice stars with soft edges, and we've got, in this case, some fairly natural colors. Should be, because this was shot at a Bortle 1 dark site, so no excuse not to get those right. Now, if you're using a Newtonian type telescope or a reflector, as our colleague Jeff Healy has, and Jeff's a Melbourne-based photographer here who has recently won some awards as well. Jeff's got a fantastic telescope. It's a handcrafted carbon fiber instrument. I'll put in a plug for Sidereal Trading here. There's a local company who builds these things and sells them worldwide, and they're absolutely beautiful. But what's really nice here, and what the judges will be looking for if you're using a Newtonian, you see how you've got prismatic effect running through the stars with the star spikes themselves. They're not just a uniform blue or orange color. You can actually see that rainbow effect running through. And that simply shows that this object, this OTA, I beg your pardon, is perfectly collimated. And that's what the result will be. You'll get this beautiful, sharp, crisp star spikes in this image. And Jeff's got a fantastic result right there. And whatever you do, I know there's a program out there, I think it's Star Spikes 4, and that gives you the opportunity, if you use a refractor to create these star spikes, don't, just don't go there. It's tempting, I know. You might think, oh, gee, this would look great if I did this, but, your judges will look at your information that you've provided on AstroBin, and they'll see you've shot this with a with a refractor and you've got these star spikes in it, and they'll start asking questions about, well, why did they do that? Just because you could. So just be careful with some of those plugins that you don't want to get too carried away, even though you think it might look nice. Color palette is a very subjective thing. And this is an image of BBW56, which is Southern Target in Papas. And it's pretty cool. It looks a bit like a mountain. It's a funky thing. But what's really interesting is there's a strong presence here of hydrogen and an equally strong presence of ionized sulfur. And of course, if you do a Hubble palette with this one, where you apply and assign green to hydrogen and red to the sulfur, well, if you mix equal quantities of green and red, you're going to get yellow. And in this coastline here, you'll see it is quite yellow, but Felipe has backed that yellow off and made a bit more of a subtle presentation by comparison directly with my version of it here, which is, boom, where's my sunglasses? It just looked like the Queensland coast to me here in Australia. So I guess that's why I got a little bit carried away with the saturation. But the moral of the story is Felipe got the image of the day with his, and mine bombed. So maybe just be careful with your choices in terms of color saturation, because, you know, just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you should. Alrighty. And just on the last point here with this one on complementary colors, I've got an image here to show you by Neil Creek. And Neil Creek's another one of our local Astronomical Society of Victoria members. And Neil won an award at the David Molen Awards with this image a few years back. And what is particularly appealing about this is the use of light pollution, which is that orange glow that you can see low on the horizon, reflected on Lake Epilogue. And that's contrasted against this beautiful, rich, deep blue of the Milky Way in the sky. And in fact, this kind of color combination, using the old color wheel, you can see here where yellow is directly opposite blue. And these are what we call complementary colors. And use of complementary colors is one of the most basic things since artists have been around. And I think probably one of the most famous examples and practitioners of this is Van Gogh himself, where you will often see on his work, you'll see cool colors and warm highlights. And so it's not a bad thing when you're creating an image, be it an astro image or even a terrestrial image, to consider what Neil's done here, using that warm highlights and cool shadows, and in fact, taking advantage of the light pollution and in his favor, producing an absolutely first-class, beautiful image. So how are you guys going? You getting something out of this so far? Hopefully. Let's talk about the stars and starless debate. So this is one for you guys. And the irony about this is this particular target is known colloquially as the Statue of Liberty Nebula. But of course, you guys don't see it because it's in the Southern Hemisphere. So this is not far from Carina. And in this case, I think might have been Steve Maslin, one of your fellow astrophotographers from the States, who colloquially named this in the first place. But if you take the stars away from this image, boom, suddenly it's a whole lot easier to actually see what's behind there. You can see the nebulosity, you can see the shapes and the forms within that nebulosity, and you've got a really clear view now of, you know, Lady Liberty herself. Or indeed, as I like to think of it, being a child of the 80s, is it the keyboard player from Duran Duran about to hit a high note on his keyboard? Can anyone else see that, or is that just me? You've all gone very quiet. Anyway, the guys at APOD liked that one, and they gave a gong for the starless version. And it's just interesting. Sometimes stars and starless images, you know, they're a bit of a fad, but sometimes they work and maybe sometimes they don't. But it's always good to experiment a little bit. So the third of our main groups of imagery criteria to touch on, we've already talked about sort of your equipment and your technical side of things. We've talked a little bit about processing choices. Well, now we're going to talk about the X factor. And this is probably the most important of all when it comes to photographic competitions. And these are some of the issues that are some of the factors that we really want to consider and consider carefully in our image making. And probably the first and foremost one is impact. You know, we want that image, our photo, we want it to slam dunk people. You know, we want it to hit you over the head with a wow. And if we can do that, then we're well on the way, assuming we've ticked all the other boxes. It'd be great if your image can make you feel something, or if it tells a story. And of course, is it well composed? So let's touch on all of these and break them down. And we'll also talk about some of these other issues here and this strange thing called pareidolia. All right, so here we go. Impact, boom. Gerald won the Photographer of the Year competition with the ROG with this image last year. £10,000 prize, thank you very much. I think that's about 15,000 US dollars. Not bad, you'll take that. Fabulous image, pretty sure that's Comet Leonard. And, you know, it does all the right things. It hits you with impact. It's well composed. It's got all the right magic formula ingredients that appealed to a judging panel. And with the ROG, the judging panel it's a bit of a committee. So you've got up to 10 different people assessing these images, ultimately making the decision. And obviously some of those people are going to be looking at these things from some of the factors that we've already talked about, some of the more technical ones, and some of them will be more influenced by some of the creative decisions. And when you've got a large committee, as opposed to maybe just a single judge or a judging panel of, you know, perhaps 3 or 4, it's really a challenge to get your image, first of all, shortlisted, because in this particular competition, they have 5,000 entries a year. And I think they all shortlist about 150 of those. Is that right, Steve? And if you're lucky enough to be shortlisted, as indeed Steve and I were both this year, then you sort of really feel like maybe your image is done well. James McGooley, who's an Australian based out of Canberra, was a finalist this year in the Australian Photographic Prize for Astrophotography. This image is so simple and yet breathtaking in its simplicity. That amazing contrast between Sigma Scorpii, that bright blue star and again, he's used one of those same sidereal trading AstroWorks telescopes, because that star is absolutely perfect. But the contrast between that blue star and that warm red hydrogen-rich cloud, it's beautiful. And it's really, really simple. And that's the kind of image that has impact. And in this case, it has impact because it's so very subtle. All right. Let's move on to emotional responses. It's a little bit tough with an Astro image to get you to feel something. But in this particular case, this photographer, Hannah Rochford, has shared, I guess, a little bit of the amazing moment of this moonrise with all of these wonderful people who are enjoying that moment themselves and sharing that. And, you know, you can see there's different ages there, and there's families and kids and all kinds of stuff. And Hannah's been pretty clever with her equipment choices here. I think it's likely she's used probably about a 600mm lens to make that scale with that moon and the figures there. And, you know, this kind of thing's been done before by Mark G and various others, and done well. And this is by no means, what am I trying to say? This is a very good example of this, because it just gives you that wonder of space, as indeed does this image here by Mark G. And here we have, you know, what is likely an older person and a younger person, could be father and son, could be grandparent and grandchild, could be big and little brother or sibling, any combination you like. But the joy there is you've got two people enjoying space and just enjoying that moment, and we can all identify with it. We can all relate to it. And if somehow you can find something in your Astro image that people can relate to, then they can connect with it. And it sort of takes it on a different level, because it hits you in the feels. if you are able to perhaps tell a story with your image. That's a little bit more challenging, I agree. But in this particular instance, this is an image I shot a few years ago when I was a little bit inspired by Van Gogh's famous sunflowers painting. And I was probably quite lucky growing up. In high school, I had a fabulous art teacher who was kind enough to share with us his passion for all the great masters of, the Renaissance and all the other various art movements and Cubism and Dada and everything else. And I guess that had a bit of an effect on me, being a bit of a creative soul. And so in this case, I kind of figured if we took this classic triplet of M20, M8, and NGC 6334, but we framed it in such a way that it kind of hinted at Van Gogh's sunflowers, then maybe people might like it. And indeed, it was popular, and APOD guys liked it, and so forth. And that's a pretty cool thing when you work in isolation, you're in your backyard, you're just chipping away with your telescope, and you're making an image. And somehow, if it gets onto the world stage, I mean, APOD gets something like 2 or 3 million hits a day if you're lucky enough to get your image up that far. And it's an extraordinary thing that, here you are in your backyard and suddenly you're sharing an image with millions of people. It's kind of cool. But there is no magic formula, I'm sorry, for APOD. I've put in so many pictures that haven't that haven't gone anywhere. Pardon me. That it really is luck of the draw. Excuse me 1 second. Just mute myself while I cough. Okay. All righty. Let's talk about something that's dear to my heart and indeed to Steve's, and that's the world of composition. Because here we have a classic image of M20. I think I might have shot this 10 years ago. And I was pretty happy with this at the time, first of all, because I think it might have been one of the very first images that I ever captured that, oh my gosh, I've got the thing. I've found it. I've captured it. The stars around, it's in focus. And I think after all the issues I might have had that night shooting this thing with dodging clouds and rain and tripods that collapsing and you name it, we had all those issues. But to actually walk away with this, I was absolutely delighted. That said, it's not a particularly interesting image. I revisited that some years later and started thinking about framing as a photographer would think about framing. So not just, I'm just going to pop this thing in the middle. Now I'm going to start thinking about the context of what it is and the stars that surround it and some of the star clusters that are around there. And indeed starting to think about the colors of the stars. In this case, this object is more or less in the middle of, the core of the Milky Way. As we looked up, we're looking pretty much straight up into bazillions of stars. And indeed, on my original image, you couldn't see almost any of them. But on the revisited version, you can see a hell of a lot more. So I guess the moral of the story here is, tempting though it may be, and I know that a bunch of guys will come out to me and say, look, I've spent $25,000 on my optics. I want that galaxy in the middle because that's where it's going to look sharpest and clearest. And it's like, yep, you're right. But it may not present the most interesting photograph compositionally, because after all, at the end of the day, we're creating photographs. Okay. Let's talk about a thing that may help a lot of people. And this is the rule of thirds. And this is a really basic photographic technique that we can all apply in our astrophotography. And essentially what we want to do is divide your image up into thirds and have whatever the hero of your image is sit on one of these dividing lines. So in this case, we've got the gem cluster in Carina, and it's pretty much bang on there in this square composition, sitting on one of those intersecting lines for the rule of thirds. Image by James Garlick, who won a Molen Award some years ago with this particular image. And when I put the rule of thirds on in this one, you can see it's absolutely perfect. So your horizon is exactly 1/3 of the way up into the picture. The sky is 2/3 of the image. The tree, the hero tree on the right-hand side, is almost exactly placed on the bisecting lines of the rule of thirds. So in this case, it's what we might consider almost perfectly composed. And indeed, if we revisit that trifid that we showed you just before, it's sitting again on one of these intersecting lines of the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds just works. And it's something that we really should be considering when we're framing an image. So with this one that our colleague here in Victoria, Jeff Healy, won the Deep Space section of the David Molen Awards this year, which is the one of the more prestigious astrophotography awards here in Australia. You can see when we put the overlay over this one, that again, he's obeyed the rule of thirds in his composition. And it works very well, also with a lovely diagonal, almost bisecting the image. The use of the diagonal here is very strong. So it's worked a treat. One more that might be of interest here while we're talking about this is a thing called the golden ratio. Now, I don't want to go too much into the mechanics of what the golden ratio is, but I do want to share with you how it works. And what we're looking at here is a thing called a Fibonacci spiral. And in this case, on this relatively well-known painting, you'll see that the spiral ends pretty much bang on Mona Lisa's amazing expression on her mouth, that enigmatic, what we call Mona Lisa smile. So how do we use that in an astro image? Well, in this case, on an image of mine of the Sombrero Galaxy M104, you can see how with our Fibonacci spiral, it lands bang on the target. And what this is basically is a representation of the way our eye moves around an image to find the spot where it's going to rest. And if it rests where your hero of your story, of your image is, then you've made a good communication that works and is well balanced. Now you can find all of these, the golden ratio, the golden spiral, the rule of thirds, they're all in Photoshop. And as Steve might have mentioned on a talk he did the other day, if you get a large image of your proposed target, one much, much wider than your field of view, pop that onto Photoshop, bring up your field of view, you invoke the Photoshop crop tool, and then you've got the options with the crop tool of bringing up the golden ratio or the rule of thirds, et cetera, and then you can overlay this and start framing your image in a pleasing way that is not only pleasing to you, but will also tick the right boxes when the judges go to look at these things. One last thing, sorry, two last things. We'll get to the last thing later. One more thing, field of view. What I'm going to share with you now are 4 versions of the same target. So this is what they call the running chicken nebula. You only see it in the Southern Hemisphere. It's near Carina. And if you can see a running chicken in there, then you've been smoking the same stuff as what the guys at the Anglo-Australian Observatory were smoking the night they named this thing, because I can't see no chicken. Can anyone see a chicken in there? Running or otherwise? Yeah, I'm sorry. It's like, I just don't know what that's all about. But that said, it's an extraordinary target. It's one of my favorites, and it's one I've banged on many, many times. I've probably shot it a whole bunch of times. So I'm going to show you 4 versions, different framing of this target. Oh, and a side story. I ordered a new little telescope some years ago from Stellarview, from Vic and the team there. And it literally arrived at the FedEx depot as I was driving out to a star party. So I literally went to the depot, picked up the telescope, took it to the star party, unpacked it, unboxed it, shot this image, and it got an APOD. So that was pretty cool first light. Okay, same target, different telescope, different camera. So in this case, I've got the big tack out and I've got the reducer on and a larger format chip. And so we're seeing a smaller version of it. We're seeing a tighter slice. Does it work as a composition? I don't think so. I'm not particularly pleased with this composition. I think it's too tight. There's no room for this nebula to breathe. It's framed so tightly on all the on all the corners that, in my opinion, it didn't work. It
Hey,
does, however, give us. Go
Andy,
on.
though, I tell you one way it works for me is that I can see the chicken now.
Oh, okay.
The
Can you
chicken,
also see the crocodile high?
the chicken doesn't have a head, right?
No, maybe
It's one
not.
of those chickens that have had its head chopped off and it's running without the head. Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, you're right. Can you see the crocodile though? So
No.
if you look under the bright star near the middle, you'll see the crocodile with its jaws open.
Ah,
I
yes.
definitely see the crocodile.
Yeah, pretty cool. Same image, tighter, same telescope, same camera, but I've taken the reducer off. And in this case, I've shot this at native format for my telescope and created a starless version. And I was very pleased with this version of the image. I thought it looked really cool. I liked the framing. I think it worked nicely. It sit within the rule of thirds and all the other things. And the starless gave it an interesting kind of view, and it did quite well with a couple of competitions in this case. And here again, we're looking at that same thing. We're looking at that warm highlights, cool shadows, the color contrast on the color wheel. It appealed to the judges, so happy days. One last version, same target, different telescope, slightly tighter field of view because of the smaller format on the camera. We're now down to 1.3 by 1 degrees as opposed to the original one I showed you, which was 3 by 2.4. So now we're right into the heart and the guts of this nebula. You can see what they call the little Bok globules, which is probably the only relation to a chicken I can see. Bok bok, those little dots above the mountain, more or less in the middle of the frame. They're star-forming regions. But as you look towards the bottom, you can see what looks like the outline of a coal miner, maybe stoking the fires of hell here. Oh, okay, maybe that's just me over a glass of red wine, what I can see in it. But as an image, as a framing, as a composition, I thought this one worked fairly well. So that's taking the same target 4 different ways with different results and perhaps different appeal of how it's framed. Okay, the last thing on framing, I promise. But framing is important. So many of us have fallen into this trap. And the trap is, oh, look, I can fit 2 things in my field of view. I can fit, in this case, the Lobster Nebula and the Cat's Paw Nebula. Great. Not, because your eye wants to look at the lobster, and then it wants to look at the cat's paw, and then it goes to the lobster, and then it goes to the cat's paw, and eventually, darting backwards and forwards so many times, your eye gets tired, and it just rests in the middle, where there's nothing happening. So as a composition, in my opinion, this fails, because, well, it's not paying attention to any of the compositional guidelines, if you like, that we've touched on. And it's kind of one of those, just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you should, examples that we see a lot. So for what it's worth, keep that in the back of your mind. All right. How you guys going? You still with us? We've got about 10 minutes to go.
Yes, please keep going.
All right. All right. Pareidolia. I want you all to just take a moment, close your eyes, go back to your childhood, maybe 6, 7 years old. Just lie on the grass outside, look up at the clouds. Can you see a bunny rabbit? Can you see a lizard? Can you maybe see a mountain? Can you see an aeroplane? No, that probably is an aeroplane. But can you see a shape in those clouds? I mean, subconsciously, we all do it. It's just their mind trying to make sense out of something nebulous that maybe doesn't have a shape. So in this case, back in 1976, the Viking orbiter captured this image, and there was quite a stir because suddenly there's people on Mars. There's a face on Mars. Oh my gosh. And this was before Instagram and Facebook, before the web. But of course, later captures at different seasons, by different vehicles, different orbits. None of these shadows were revealed in quite the same way. It's just that in this case, it looked a bit like a human face, as indeed this target, the Helix Nebula, however it's processed, it kind of resembles an eye, which is why it's called the Eye of God in popular culture. And when I shot this one, and oh my gosh, I don't know why I spent it, but I spent 76 hours shooting this one. I think I was down to getting like 1 photon per hour shooting this from a Bortle 7 neighborhood. But with the processing, with a few masking tricks and tweaks, I guess it looks even more like an iris of an eye in this case. And yeah, it was popular and well received, and it did well in various competitions. And maybe it's just that thing that judges latch onto, that slightly, they can identify, they can see something in there that they can relate to, they can tell a story with it. As indeed this one, which is a very popular target now in Scorpius, SL17, the Wolf Nebula, because this thing, I hope you can see it, looks like a wolf. And it's just, it's obviously a bunch of interstellar dust that's backlit by ionized hydrogen, but it does look like a wolf. And James Beguli, I think he's in the shortlist this year with the International Astronomy Photography of the Year competition with a starless version of this one, which made it even clearer and easier to see. So pareidolia is something that is pretty cool if you can find something that looks like something, so the judges have something to talk about when they go to describe your image to their fellow judges as being, well, I'd like to promote this one, because on AstroBin, as judges, when it gets to that final point, any one of 8 judges can nominate an image and it will be image of the day. But we, as the other 7 judges, we can make comments on that choice about, well, maybe if we look at it at 100%, those stars don't look that good. Or maybe there's something about this image that looks absolutely fantastic, and I completely agree that it should definitely be an image of the day. So there's still that debate process going on right up until the end in the judging forums. And sometimes we'll get 7, 8, 9 comments about one image, about, finally, will it be an image of the day or will it get pulled? Because the judge has the right to withdraw that nomination at any time, but no one else can withdraw that nomination from that judge. So that's kind of how it works. The only sad bit about that whole process is all those comments are kept from you. I'm not sure exactly what the process is there with Sal. Maybe it's something we need to talk about, but those comments remain, I guess, behind closed doors. Okay, comparative excellence. And this is one, when I was mentioning to Steve I was going to run this talk, that he prompted me to consider. And I think it's a really good point. And here's Steve's image that won the Australian Photographic Prize recently. Now, just to give you a little bit of a heads up, the Australian Photographic Prize is something that my wife initiated. And last year, I was the competition director for the Astrophotography category. And we had images from, I think, 450 different photographers worldwide from, let me get the facts right, 22 countries, 5 continents, blah, blah, blah. And Steve's image here was the winner in a very close fought competition. Now, what's interesting about this image is that Steve's photographed arguably the most singularly popular target in the Southern Hemisphere for astrophotographers. This is a piece of the Carina Nebula. What the Carina Nebula looks like in its entirety on the image on the right, which is a 7-panel mosaic that I created some years ago, you can see there's a lot going on there. And what a lot of photographers choose to do is they kind of shoot the middle bit here, which you can see on the left, which is just a HA RGB version. But there's a lot going on in this nebula. There's a lot to choose And as you saw when we looked at the running chicken earlier, there are lots of different bits that you could choose to photograph, or indeed photograph the whole thing. Here's another bit that looks really cool. I call this one the Smoking Man, because it looked a bit like that bad guy from the X-Files. So brilliantly played by William. It'll come to me later. Sorry, shouldn't have thought of that because now it's going to bug me. But what Steve did, he photographed that slice of it beautifully. And what we're seeing here is amazing color palette. We've got warm highlights, cool shadows, beautiful interaction of detail within that. He's picked on all the best bits of it. He's got everything from working from the far left, the Gabriele Mistral Nebula, so named after a Chilean poet in profile, because it resembles her, and arguably it does. You're working your way across. You've got the Homunculus Nebula on the far right with the Eta Carina star itself. You've got the fickle finger of God in there. I mean, everything, all the best bits, I guess, are captured in this unique frame, this unique panoramic frame. And, to stand on the shoulders of all of those other astrophotographers with an image of something that everyone has photographed is no mean feat. And congratulations again, Steve, for pulling that off. But what that really goes to show you is that it doesn't matter what you're shooting. If you want to go out and shoot M42 for the umpteenth time, go ahead and do it, because you might be the one who finds the unique way of shooting it that no one else has considered, because it's a beautiful thing, and, go for it. Let's give another example. This is your classic M20 Trifid Nebula. I'll use this one because you guys get this as well as us. David Molen created the definitive version of this many years ago from the Anglo-Australian Observatory. David Molen, in case you're not aware, is widely regarded as the godfather of astrophotography. So I set about myself a task of how close can I get an image of the Trifid Nebula as close to this one of David's. So I shot this from my Portal 7 backyard a few years ago. And I'd shot this purely as a technical exercise to try and figure out, how am I going to overcome the light pollution? How can I capture this? How can I do this? And what can I learn along the way? And you should have seen the layers palette in Photoshop on this one. It was crazy. Ultimately creating, the reflection nebula from a blue layer and coloring that and doing all kinds of crazy things. But I managed to get something that I thought was pretty darn close to David's image. And I literally did that just because I could. But then along came a few years later, a chap called Paul Montague, and Paul images from the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, Portal 1, pitch black skies. And he created this beautiful version of the Trifid Nebula, which won a David Molen Award for the deep space category. And of course, he didn't have to deal with, Portal 7 skies. He's got everything working for him. And this is what I was perhaps alluding to earlier, getting your technical factors correct, getting everything right, getting your environmental factors working, having a finely and precisely tuned instrument. In this case, I think this is an RC8. And it's a beautiful result of a fabulous classic target. Well done to David, to Paul, I beg your pardon. And finally, one of your colleagues here, Kevin Morfield. Kevin came this close to winning the deep space section of the Australian Photographic Prize this year, but he was pipped out by Steve. But in this particular image, which Mike Sidonio, who was one of our judges, said he regarded as the single finest image of M20 that he had ever seen, that's fairly high praise from strongman Mike Sidonio, who's widely recognised as one of the leading astrophotographers in Australia. Kevin has used every filter in this. He's used L, R, G, B, HA, O3, and S2. He's used the lot. He hasn't left any stone unturned when he created this. And it's a stunning version. It's probably the definitive version of the Trifid Nebula. And it's amazing. So if you're going to shoot a Trifid and put it in a competition, there's your competition. because that's as good as it gets so far, we think. All right, and that's what comparative excellence is. It's a case of take your image, compare it with what's gone before, and compare literally. Do your research and see, well, what's out there. Okay, let's talk about research now. Sorry, guys, we've run a little bit over time. Hope that's okay. We're almost at the end. Okay, research. What is research? Well, in my case, I got a little bit excited about the astrophotography thing. I was a few years into the journey and I thought, well, I don't want to shoot the same stuff that everyone else is shooting. I want to see if I can find something new to shoot. And so what you're looking at here is the world's first high-res color image of this particular object, which is a supernova remnant in Ara. And it was a massive project because even with my little SV70 telescope, which had a very wide field of view, this was a 6-panel mosaic. It was the only image I shot that season over 6 months. And once I started, I just kind of had to keep going. And it's amazing when you start thinking about it, because when you look at Galaxy Map here, and this is a great resource if you haven't become familiar with this. So this is free, galaxymap.org. And what you're looking at here is a supercosmos hydrogen alpha survey of the Milky Way. And you can see down towards the bottom right-hand side, you can see this faint tendrils. I'm sorry, I'm using my finger to point at this, which is absolutely useless to you because you can't see my finger. You can see the supernova remnant there in Ara. And I looked at this and I thought, what the heck is that? I couldn't find any references to it. I couldn't find any images of it. And I finally found a super wide field version of an image by a chap called John Gleason, who'd shot it in HA. And I thought, okay, I want to get into this thing and I want to have a crack at this and shoot it. And there it is, literally. And I thought, all right, here we go. So what we're looking at is something that had impact because no one had seen it before. It just about fits in the composition and balance, you know, maybe it's a little tight, but you sort of have to stop somewhere. This thing is still expanding, so it's amazing. As far as storytelling goes, supernova remnants are incredible. You know, there's one in Vela that's expanding at where the Herschel's ray is. That thing's shooting through at 500,000 kilometers an hour. That stuff is just ejected into space. There's no stopping it. And this thing is still growing and expanding. Pareidolia, I showed this to my kids. I said, what does that look like? And one of them said, looks like a dragon's heart, Daddy. And I thought, ooh, that's a good name. We'll call it that. And that's the joy of this thing. If you find something relatively new and, you know, you're the first person to do something with it, you can give it a bit of a nickname. And I had to go and find a scientific paper, in fact, to find any information about this thing. Comparative excellence with other versions? Well, there were no other versions to compare it to. So I won't say it was a new discovery because, you know, it was there on Galaxy Map, but doing the research, it was a new object to shoot. And there are more out there. You've just got to be patient. Or indeed, like some of the very clever people that are out there, like Bray Falls, for example, you can go and discover something completely new. And this is one that Bray has come across. And this is the first image of this thing, which he calls the Gas Nebula. Again, he photographed it for the first time. He found it, he discovered it. So you can call it anything you like. And he liked Minecraft. So he thought it looked like a ghast. So there it is. What is it? Well, Bray describes it as it could just be a really hot star creating a bow shock front as it's moving through space. But it's got all the magic. I mean, I look at this and I think immediately of the stills for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is my all-time favorite movie of, you know, ever made. But I look at this and it just looks to me like a Stargate. It's got pareidolia written all over it, or maybe it's just a big, you know, cyan banana. I don't know. But, you know, I look at the composition of this and it's just, in my opinion, almost perfect. I just love the way that this is balanced. Comparative excellence, you can't compare it. There are no other versions of this thing. This is unique and original, and it's a new discovery. So, you know, there are teams of people around the world, and in fact, I believe Steve's even on one of them, finding new stuff to shoot, and it's hard. And if you're going to do this, most of these people who are discovering and finding these new targets, you got to be prepared to put the time in, because most of these are like 100 hours of exposure time. And that's why they're new and undiscovered, because who's going to be crazy enough to spend 100 hours shooting something? Well, that's the reward you get. And so finally, picking up on this whole business of research and discovery, you're probably familiar with this one. So Marcel, Xavier, and Jan picked up the gong for the photographer of the year last year for this image. Now, there's been thousands of images of Andromeda M31, but this is the first one which is showing this extraordinary feature of this arc of ionized oxygen. I mean, it's got wow factor written all over it. It's got impact. Boom, composition, golden ratio. Check this out. There it is. Like, boom. It's absolutely perfect. And here's the thing about composition, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but if you're going to go out and spend 10, 20, 100 hours photographing something, you want to make sure that it's composed well, because you can't go back and do it again because you'd be mad. What else has it got? Storytelling. What is that arc? Why is it there? How is it there? It fits the field of view perfectly. We've already seen it's perfectly framed. Comparative excellence blows all the other images away, because this is the first one showing this thing. And so obviously, as a new discovery, it's ticking all those boxes. Now, I'm not saying that if you want to get an IOTD or an APOD or win a competition, you have to go out and spend 100 hours shooting something and discover something new. Because as Steve has proven, you can shoot a popular target in a new way. And what was that, Steve? What, 10 hours, 20 hours maybe on your Carina image, I'm guessing?
That was 20 hours, 2-panel
20
mosaic.
hours. Yep, there you go. So that's achievable. That's doable. Something like this is extraordinary, and it deserves all the accolades that it got. And you don't have to do that. But if you follow some of those guidelines of what we've already shown, then you're on the right path to maybe getting a little bit, more recognition for your images. So here's a list that I've compiled of astrophotography competitions that I'm aware of. There may be more, but these are the ones I've found so far. So obviously we've got the one we've touched on a few times tonight, which is the Royal Museum's Greenwich. Now, anyone can enter this from anywhere in the world, and it's the big daddy of them all, gets 5,000 entries, 15,000 US first prize. This year, you'll see something new, the Astrophotography Prize, which was formerly known as the Australian Photographic Prize Astrophotography category. This is an international prize that we hope you'll all continue to enter, because this is international. So we're not limiting it by any means just to Australians. The Polish group has Astro Camera Hewlenium. I hope I pronounced that right. This is an international competition. First prize is about 750 US dollars, I think, from memory. And it's one that's well worth having a look at. We've touched on the David Molen Awards already. Unfortunately, they're for Australians only. And the Bintel Awards, same story. Various companies and manufacturers like to promote their products by having competitions. They include Attic, QSI, Skywatcher, Optolong, and there will be others. But these are brand use and specific. In other words, you have to use a Skywatcher instrument to enter the Skywatcher photography competition. So that's how it is. It's their money. It's their choice. Some other countries have their own astrophotography competition. New Zealand has one for New Zealanders. I just heard about one that is in India for Indian residents. It's crazy. I couldn't find one in the US. I might be wrong, but I couldn't find one. And of course, then you've got APOD and APOD 2. Now, these are not competitions as such. They're just well-known vehicles to display astrophotography to the world that you can submit to and have your image considered for publication. Alrighty. Couldn't let you go without a bit of a plug, guys. Sorry. If you want to improve your processing, think, Bruce, this might be for you. I have published all of my secrets. Everything I've ever done is here in 39-page, step-by-step, how I process my images. And it is there on special for you guys for a princely sum of $19 as a downloadable PDF from my website. You can download that immediately up until the 31st of January. It's normally, get this right in a minute, $29 US, but $10 off for you guys. So check that out. It may be of some value to you. A lot of people have downloaded that and found it useful. It's got everything in it that I can throw a stick at. So finally, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have a chance to share with you a little bit of the thoughts of what astrophotography competitions are about, what judges look for, what they like, what they don't like, ways you can look at your own images, how to improve, all that sort of stuff. So if it's all right with you guys, I'll stop sharing and open to any questions that you might have.
All right, well, first of all, thank you very much, Andy. That was wonderful. And I want to encourage folks to ask some questions right now. So mic is open.
I think Vikram's got his hand up.
Well, no need to raise your hand, just speak.
They might be muted. Hi.
Oh, well, they can unmute themselves. Please unmute yourself. Is anybody...
Andy, you talked a little bit about naming the object or naming the photo. In what way does the title and the description that goes along with the photo enter into judges' thoughts?
I guess it could be a stimulus. Some competitions do not allow you to have a title of your image. Your image is literally assessed standalone. But if your image does have a title that you think is contributing something of value that maybe will prompt or stimulate the judges to start heading down a particular train of thought, then maybe that's a benefit. But if your image of M42 is titled the Orion Nebula, that's probably not going to really give them anything more to work with. But if you've perhaps got a slice of it and you've called it the Sword of Orion, and perhaps the piece of it that you've captured maybe resembles a sword or has some reference to some colloquialism there, then maybe you're on the right track. So, for example, if you were the first person to photograph the Statue of Liberty Nebula, which is not its official name, it's just, I guess it's, colloquial name. But if you've titled it the Statue of Liberty Nebula and someone's looking at it for the first time and they go, oh, you're right, I do see a Statue of Liberty in there, that's brilliant. Then obviously that's going to set the judge's mind in a positive sense of what they're going to be thinking about with their assessment. Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
Welcome.
Excellent presentation.
Most welcome, Steve. I think Vikram had a question earlier.
Well, I will unmute Vikram just in case he is having trouble. Well, I can't. I have to ask to unmute, so he's got to do it himself.
And Jay Noah had their hand up as well.
I believe they were clapping.
Oh,
That's correct.
okay.
Give an applaud. I applaud. A wonderful presentation.
Sorry, missed that. Lost in translation.
All right, I'll ask a question in hopes of getting more. Well, what is your opinion on, some folks have that $20,000 telescope and some folks have that $1,500 telescope. And, you showed a guiding plot with, 0.4 RMS, and not everybody can do that with their equipment. It's just the fact of life.
Yep.
I mean, if you don't have the I know what I'm about to say is not true, but I'll say it anyway. if you don't have the super fancy equipment, is it the case that you can't, you know, do well in these competitions?
No, not at all. I know from my own personal point of view, I won a David Molen Award for Deep Space in 2015 with very modest equipment. And it was a EQ6 mount, William Optics FLT 110 telescope, and nice mono camera. But I mean, it was pretty modest equipment. And, you know, there were some other players in there with, you know, massive, you know, like you said, $25,000, you know, permanent observatories in the country. It's, you know, like Steve himself, Steve's equipment is nice, and it's not 100 grand, is it, Steve?
No, and I was actually going to chime in on that. Like, I ended up winning, which is amazing, but it's modest equipment that's, I think, accessible. And Kevin, for example, and I think he wouldn't mind saying me saying this, but has really super awesome equipment on top of a mountain in Chile, and I ended up taking it home, which is amazing. But I think framing and doing something special with the target is really that's going to take you over the edge. Personally, yeah.
Exactly. Got to echo everything Steve said. It's not what you got, it's how you use it.
So
You
do judges allow for the fact that if you shoot from Bortle 7 or 8 conditions, you know, the image might not be quite as pristine as a Bortle 1 image?
I think it kind of works the other way. If I'm assessing an image and I see it's from Chile Scope or Deep Sky West or any of the popular sites where you can rent telescope time from perfectly tuned precision instruments in the most fabulous locations around the world. If I look at an image from there, I'm going to expect it to be damn well perfect. I'm going to expect to see fantastic quality first and foremost, because if it's not, I'm going to be thinking, well, they've kind of not got the most out of that equipment that they're using. And I'll probably come down a bit harder on that image. And that's not to say I'm going to reward someone shooting from Bortle 8 with a inexpensive telescope, but I'll probably look at the person who shot from Bortle 8 with that inexpensive telescope. If they've done a really good job, then I'm probably going to be thinking, okay, this is seriously impressive, the way they've shot, framed, processed, and captured that using this equipment. I think that will go in their favor. But ultimately, it's not what you use where you're assessing the final image. And whether that final image is taken on a plane wave or if it's taken on a Saxon Skywatcher entry unit, it's the outcome that's the most important.
Okay.
So don't be disheartened. You know, I know it's a slippery slope. I know things are expensive. And I do tell my wife that my hobby is, you know, that's good. Well, sorry, 1 second. I do tell my wife that my hobby is cheaper than a boat, but, you know,
All right.
I've been kind of lucky along the way.
Before we let Andy go, are there anybody else who's got a question to ask?
A
All
quick
right.
basic
Oh, go
question,
ahead.
please. This is great. Thank you. You mentioned the importance of a calibrated monitor, which we admit we don't always do. And I thought it was mainly color balance, but should we watch a calibrated monitor in the dark or with some ambient white light, or does that matter?
Most of the manufacturers of calibrators, be it X-Rite or Spider, they'll come with an instruction manual online, and there'll usually be a sensor in the calibrating unit itself, which will measure your ambient light in your surroundings, and it'll tell you if your ambient light is too bright or too dark for your viewing environment. So, for example, if you're working in pitch black, chances are you'll be seeing more detail in the shadows than maybe someone else is when they're assessing it in a conventionally lit room. If you're working in bright sunlight, then you're probably going to lose some of the highlight detail because your eyes just can't adjust to it. So ideally, you need to be in a neutral, well-lit, but not over bright interior environment that you can replicate and keep consistent.
And that's what the judges do, I gather. Thanks.
In a perfect world, you won't find the judges looking at their final assessment images on their iPhones. They'll be looking at, we're basically told you got to have a calibrated environment, in which case, in which to view these images. And certainly with the Australian Photographic Prize, as it was, and all these other competitions, the judges will be using calibrated screens because it's the only way to have a level playing field. It puts everyone on the same footprint, and if your image looks beautiful to you, but your image isn't calibrated, it may not look good on the judge's screen. So it's important.
So if a while back, 10, 15 years ago, I did some photography and had a calibrated monitor, which I admit I don't today, and printed and stuff like that. And it was obvious to me the benefits of the calibration system when printing my images. But if my target audience is my website, where I direct my friends to see my Astro images, and I know they're looking at it on their laptops or probably their phones, is there still an advantage to that?
I think if you start on the right foot, it's always going to end up looking better, because it's the unknown high. What looks good on my screen may not look good on yours. And what looks good on your screen is probably going to look pretty different on someone's iPhone and then someone's Huawei or their Samsung or whatever that device they're using.
I'll challenge you for a second. So all these damn devices that my buddies look at my pictures on are all way oversaturated and way over contrasty, right? Because that's how manufacturers sell their equipment.
Yeah.
So in fact, the calibrated image tends to look flat on those, doesn't it?
Calibrated image should look correct. As you said earlier, if you have a calibrated monitor and you're sending your images out to be printed,
yes, then
whatever lab you're sending them to will have a calibrated monitor. So what you send them should look like the outcome, the print should look the same as what you see on your screen. And if there's a discrepancy in between, it's going to cost you a lot of money because you're going to have to get it done again.
Right. No, I agree with that. I'm saying the buddies who are looking at it on the over contrasty laptops and phones, but anyway.
But then again, are they assessing your image with oh wow, hi, that's a great image, love it, fantastic, good job, mate? Or are they actually assessing it for a competition?
Right. No, I buy
you know what I mean? What hat are they wearing when they're looking at your picture? Are they looking at it to support you because they think astronomy is cool and they've never taken any astrophotos, so they have no barometer to measure it by? Or are we talking about someone who's, assessing your image in a competition sense?
Right. No doubt then it's important.
Andy, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Regarding calibration, do you go with sRGB or Adobe RGB, or, I find that kind of confusing, not knowing.
It can be confusing, and it depends on what device you're using and what your intended output is. So for example, in my professional photography, I use sRGB, which is the native output for my camera. And most of the internet world where most of my pictures are seen is on sRGB. That said, if I want to send an image off to have it printed at the lab, my lab works in Adobe RGB 1998, so I have to convert the images and send them that way. But the broad rule of thumb is the internet works on sRGB.
Okay, very good. That's
great. Most competitions will have in the fine print the color space in which they want you to enter your image.
Good to
because
know.
it does make a difference. Yeah. But I don't want to get too technical on that stuff because that's always in the rules of all the different competitions that you'll enter. It's always there. And it's a minefield, as you'll no doubt learn. Very good. Any other questions, guys? Or are you guys ready to go and have, you know, cup of coffee and a nightcap?
One question, do you do how much of your processing is done with Photoshop? Do you do all of it through Photoshop or do you use any other applications for processing?
Once I've got my capture, which is all happening through Voyager, I do my image calibration and stacking in Astropixel processor. I then output my masters from Astropixel processor straight to Photoshop and go on from there. There are other people who use different apps for different purposes. PixInsight, for example, is very, very popular. It doesn't appeal to me because I'm a visual person and I just frankly can't get my head around PixInsight. But, you know, horses for courses. If you can get your head around PixInsight, I've seen some stunning work produced using that platform, and you could talk to Steve about that because he uses it. But ultimately, you want to use the platform that works for you. So if you use, for example, Deep Sky Stacker or Astropixel Processor or MaximDL, there's all different applications, and you ultimately just need to find the one that works for you, that gives you the outcome that you want. I'm a natural Photoshop user because I've been using it my entire career as a professional photographer. So I gravitated to that and it works for me.
Great, thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Well, it sounds like at this point, maybe we should give Andy a break. It's been a
Sounds like we've sort of filled their heads with too much information, and they've got to spend a bit of time processing all of that, I think.
No, I think I know I imagine pretty much everybody really appreciate this talk, Andy. So could everybody please unmute themselves and go ahead before I.
Sorry, hi, just one last question. Will this be available online as a resource for people?
Absolutely. I'll send you and everybody on this mailing list the link.
Thank you so much.
Usually in less than a week. So please unmute yourselves and give Andy a big round of applause.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you, Andy.
Been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.